Today we're going to talk about consequentialism, specifically the most dominant subtheory of consequentialism, utilitarianism. This theory says that right action is that which creates the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In this video, we'll talk about what consequentialism means, what goodness means for a utilitarian, how different utilitarians understand right action, and some strengths and weaknesses of utilitarianism and consequentialism overall. To understand what consequentialism means compared to other ethical theories, let's start with the basic formula for an ethical interaction. We have a moral agent. Let's call her Agam. In this equation, as a moral agent, Agam is someone who can take an ethical action. Then, we have the action itself. It doesn't need a name. And finally, we have a moral patient. Let's call him Partik. As a moral patient, Partik is someone who matters when an action is done to him. So we have a moral agent, their action, and the moral patient to whom the action is done. This is a basic sketch of a moral interaction. Consequentialism cares only about the consequences of an action. As consequentialists, we don't care what Agam's motivation is or how she feels when she takes an action. We don't even really care what the action is. We only care about the effects of that action on Partik, the moral patient. If we only care about the moral patient, we might need to ask ourselves, who counts as a moral patient, and to what degree? Is Partik a moral patient when he's a baby? What about if he were a group of people? What about an institution, or Partik the cat, or Partik the toaster? These are kinds of questions consequentialists ask. Who is affected by actions, and how? Jeremy Bentham, an 18th century philosopher and social reformer, is a good candidate for the founding father of modern consequentialism. He argued that happiness or pleasure, from the Greek hedone, is the best measure of an action's consequences. Importantly, this is a biological and material idea. Rather than depend on abstract categories of goodness, Bentham is looking at how we can more or less empirically measure the effects of an action. Happiness occurs in our bodies. We smile, we feel warm, we feel pleasure, while something like virtue or duty is too abstract for his scientific thinking. And what a scientist he was! Bentham created the Felicific Calculus, a way to mathematically determine which action would fulfill his axiom to bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number, neutrally considered. We call this Quantitative Utilitarianism because it addresses all pleasures as one-dimensional quantities. Let's do some math. Let's say that eating a cookie gives anyone 5 utils or units of pleasure. Eating 2 cookies would then obviously bring 10 units of pleasure. Let's assume that making cookies costs you 10 units of pleasure per 10 cookies, and even if you like baking, let's agree for this example that making cookies is work, not play. If you made 10 cookies, it would cost you 10 pleasure, or create 10 pain, for a total of -10. But if you share those 10 cookies with 4 friends, that's 5 times 10 for 50 utils and an overall gain of 40. Making cookies is definitely an ethical act. In quantitative utilitarianism, we don't always have to compare similar things. Say you have enough time either to make cookies or to go on a hike with your friends. Hiking is work, for sure, but let's save some math and say that you can net 15 pleasure if you hike for the same amount of time that it takes to make the cookies. Turns out, hiking is more ethical than cookies, alas. John Stuart Mill takes a slightly different, qualitative approach to these calculations. He argues that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. In other words, some pleasures, like philosophy, are simply always of a higher order than other pleasures. Mill might argue that cookies are a simple pleasure, while hiking with your friends is a more complex, more valuable pleasure. In qualitative utilitarianism, it's possible that no amount of cookies you eat would equal the hike. While the fool might be living his best life, and Socrates is not really feeling it, no amount of the fool's reality TV binge-watching will equal Socrates' pleasures of philosophy and politics. You might only get 10 utils of pleasure from watching this video, but those are philosophy utils, and they will far outweigh the utils you'd get from going and eating cookies right now. In both cases, we're aiming to find the optimific choice, the act that creates the most pleasure or alleviates the most pain, even if we first hierarchize those pleasures and pains according to Mill's Qualitative Utilitarianism. Now, hiking versus cookies is not really an ethical issue, but let's imagine that you're a doctor, and you only have the time and resources to either attend a lecture on a new procedure or save a patient's life with the old procedure. Attending a lecture sounds like a pain, maybe minus 20 utils. Saving a life sounds like one of the best goods we could perform, let's say 1,000 utils. Easy math. Except that utilitarianism wants us to think about how we can create the greatest good for the greatest number. We can't just stop the equation there. What if with the old procedure, you'll save 100 patients over your career, 100,000 utils? But if you learn this new procedure, you'll save 102 patients. Uh-oh. If you go to the lecture, you lose out on the opportunity to create pleasure by saving that one patient, but you'll gain a net of one more patient if you learn the new procedure. It turns out, attending the lecture might be the more ethical choice. This kind of contingency is where utilitarianism becomes complicated and valuable. We have to think about the ramifications of our actions as they extend out into the future. It's no coincidence that utilitarianism grew in popularity with the science of statistics. We're doing probability and prediction here. We should make one more distinction between kinds of utilitarianism. Bentham's act utilitarianism would look at the lecture versus surgery case in isolation. It would ask, will I probably create more pleasure or alleviate more pain if I make this choice right now? Mill's rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, is concerned about precedents and algorithms. Can I make a rule that whenever I have the opportunity to learn a new procedure, I should do so? And if I create that rule, will I have a higher probability to create more pleasure and alleviate more pain? In that case, I'll make that rule. A doctor who is an act utilitarian might show up at one lecture but skip the next. A doctor who is a rule utilitarian might show up at all the lectures because they've determined that, probabilistically speaking, they're going to create more net benefit for more people if they follow that rule. Importantly, as we do all this math, we must think about these ramifications neutrally considered. Let's make a sharp turn away from the joy of cookies. Let's imagine that there are 10 of us in a cave, you, 8 friends, and a stranger, and the tide starts to come in. On our way out, the stranger, who is a little larger than the rest of us, gets stuck in the mouth of the cave. The water is coming in fast, and we're running out of air. But we have some dynamite. We could blow up this stranger and save ourselves and our friends. Let's set aside the physics of the explosion and how we'll probably all die if we take that choice. Because 1 is less than 9, we should do it. But what if we change the equation? Now it's you, 1 friend, and 8 strangers. Your friend gets stuck. Should you still blow them up? Utilitarianism says yes. From a scientifically detached, neutral perspective, your friend doesn't matter more than a stranger. This keeps us from making decisions that only benefit us, or from valuing people we like over people we don't know or don't like. It's important here that none of us want to do this. As Nielsen argues, we don't have to feel good about blowing anyone up, but it's actually more heinous for 10 people to die in here simply because we don't want to kill one person. This is the idea of negative responsibility. We are responsible for our non-actions as we are for our actions. By not taking action to kill the fat man, we are causing harm to those of us still in the cave. Even though the water kills us, that doesn't let us off the hook for doing nothing. Bernard Williams is unconvinced by this idea of negative responsibility. What if, he says, we're simply walking along in the countryside when we come upon someone who presents us with a terrible choice? They're going to kill 10 prisoners, but if we take the gun and kill one of the prisoners, they'll let the others go. There's no good option here. We can't create pleasure. But we can alleviate pain, which makes it right. We're still looking for the optimific choice, even if that means a total of negative 1,000 over negative 10,000. Nielsen might argue from the perspective of negative responsibility that if we don't pull the trigger, we're responsible for the 10 deaths. But Williams argues that doesn't really seem like how the world works. Are we truly responsible for this terrible scenario? Can this person really place this weight on us and pretend like it's our fault for 1 or 10 people dying? What about our own moral integrity? If these objections sound reasonable to you, it's because they might well be. And that's why we have theories that look at Agam and her actions as well. But we'll have to save that for a later video.